October 8th, 1667. Samuel Pepys, the sharp-eyed naval administrator whose diaries would become England's most intimate window into the 17th century, stood before a house so vast it defied comprehension. "It is a very fine house," he would write that evening, but these simple words concealed his astonishment. Before him stretched not merely an aristocratic residence, but a palace that rivaled Windsor, Hampton Court, and Whitehall itself. Stone facades extended in every direction. Twin towers soared skyward. Courtyards large enough to parade entire regiments opened one after another like chambers in a giant's castle. This was Audley End at the height of its glory, a monument to one man's ambition so grandiose that it would ultimately consume both its creator and the fortune he built. Within 5 decades, the crown itself would purchase this colossus. Within another century, 2/3 of it would be demolished, torn down stone by stone, its very magnificence having become unbearable. This is the story of Audley End House, England's most spectacular Jacobean mansion, a prodigy house that grew too large for its own good, that bankrupted an earl, seduced a king, and survived centuries of demolition to stand today as a testament to an age when ambition knew no bounds. To understand Audley End, you must first understand the extraordinary scale of what was created here in the early 17th century. The house that Samuel Pepys saw in 1667 was approximately 3 times larger than the already massive structure that survives today. Imagine the current building, itself containing dozens of rooms, grand halls, and elaborate state apartments, then triple it. The original Audley End was built around 2 enormous courtyards with wings extending in every direction, a layout more suitable for a royal palace than a private residence. The facade stretched more than 300 feet across, with 2 great courts, galleries that seemed to stretch into infinity, and enough accommodation to house not just a noble family but the entire royal court. When completed around 1614, it was quite possibly the largest private house in England, surpassing even the grandest creations of Elizabeth I's reign. The modern visitor to Audley End, walking through what remains, is seeing only the skeleton of the original vision. Yet even this reduced form ranks among England's finest Jacobean houses. But before there was this palace, before there was scandal and bankruptcy and royal intrigue, there was an abbey. And before we can understand the almost insane ambition that created the Jacobean Audley End, we must travel back to the violent religious upheaval of the 16th century, to the moment when medieval England was torn apart and reassembled according to one king's will. In the year 1538, England was in the midst of a revolution disguised as Reformation. Henry VIII, having broken with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, was systematically dismantling the entire infrastructure of Catholic monasticism that had defined English religious life for centuries. The dissolution of the monasteries, as historians would call it, was the largest transfer of property in English history since the Norman conquest. Ancient abbeys, priories, and monasteries, institutions that had stood for 500 years or more, were seized, their monks and nuns evicted, their treasures confiscated, their buildings either demolished for building materials or converted to secular use. The crown profited enormously, but the real windfall went to those courtiers shrewd or fortunate enough to receive these properties as grants from the king. Among the most fortunate was Sir Thomas Audley, a lawyer from Essex who had risen to become Lord Chancellor of England, one of the highest offices in the realm, responsible for the king's conscience and the administration of justice. Audley was no idealist. He was a pragmatist who understood that in Henry VIII's court, survival and advancement came through absolute loyalty to the king's wishes, however capricious or brutal they might be. He had played his role in the destruction of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, presiding over the trial that sent her to the scaffold on almost certainly false charges of adultery and treason. He had overseen the legal machinery that enabled Henry's subsequent marriages and divorces, and he had enthusiastically supported the dissolution, knowing that loyalty would be rewarded. His reward came in the form of Walden Abbey, a Benedictine monastery located in the pleasant Essex countryside near the market town of Saffron Walden. Founded in 1140 during the reign of King Stephen, Walden Abbey had been a moderately prosperous religious house for nearly 4 centuries. Its monks had prayed, copied manuscripts, farmed the surrounding lands, and served as spiritual guardians of the region. The abbey church was substantial, built in the cruciform plan typical of Benedictine houses, with a nave, transepts, choir, and cloisters. Surrounding buildings included dormitories, a refectory, chapter house, and all the infrastructure needed for a self-sufficient monastic community. When Sir Thomas Audley received the grant of Walden Abbey in 1538, the monks were evicted, the lands became his personal property, and he faced a decision: what to do with these medieval buildings. The church itself was too large and too explicitly religious in its architecture to serve comfortably as a private residence in its original form, but Audley was a practical man. Rather than demolish the entire complex and start fresh, he chose adaptive reuse, a common practice during the dissolution. The church would be converted. 3 floors were inserted into the soaring nave, transforming the vertical sacred space into horizontal secular rooms. The transepts and much of the choir were demolished, reducing the building to manageable proportions. On the site of the abbot's lodging, a great hall was constructed, the ceremonial heart of any aristocratic residence, where the lord received guests, held feasts, and displayed his status. The result was a hybrid, part medieval monastery, part Tudor mansion, a transitional building that reflected the violent transformation of English society during the Reformation. Sir Thomas Audley lived here until his death in 1544, having successfully navigated the treacherous politics of Henry VIII's court. He was succeeded by his daughter Margaret, who married Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk. Through her, the property passed into the Howard family, one of the most powerful aristocratic dynasties in England, a family whose ambitions would dwarf even Sir Thomas Audley's, and whose hubris would create the most spectacular private palace England had ever seen. To understand what happened next at Audley End, you must understand the Howards. This was not merely another noble family. This was a dynasty that had been at the centre of English power politics for generations, producing queens, admirals, politicians, and courtiers who shaped the nation's history. The Howards were descended from medieval nobility, and by the 16th century they were among the premier aristocratic families of the realm, but they were also a family marked by tragedy, scandal, and dangerous proximity to royal power. 2 of Henry VIII's 6 wives were Howards: Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, who was executed for adultery in 1542, and Anne Boleyn, his 2nd wife, executed 1536, whose mother was born Elizabeth Howard. Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, who had married into the Audley property, was himself executed in 1572 for plotting to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and place her on the English throne. The Howards played for the highest stakes and frequently paid the ultimate price, but the family survived, adapted, and continued to accumulate wealth and power. When Thomas Howard, grandson of the executed Duke, inherited the Audley End property in the late 16th century, he was already a man of considerable ambition and talent. Born around 1561, Thomas Howard grew up in the Elizabethan court, where success depended on a combination of martial valour, courtly grace, administrative competence, and ruthless political skill. He possessed all of these in abundance. His early career was military. In 1588, he served in the English fleet that defeated the Spanish Armada, that defining moment of English national pride, when the Protestant island nation humiliated Catholic Spain's supposedly invincible navy. Service in that great victory brought him recognition, but Thomas Howard was not content to rest on laurels earned in his 20s. He sought higher office, and he knew the path to it lay through royal favour. In 1603, everything changed. Queen Elizabeth I, who had ruled England for 45 years, died childless. The throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the 2 crowns for the first time. James was a different kind of monarch than Elizabeth, less personally charismatic, more intellectual, fond of learned debate but also of lavish display and ceremony. He brought with him from Scotland a conception of kingship that was more continental in style, more absolute in its pretensions, more expensive in its requirements. For ambitious courtiers like Thomas Howard, James I's accession was an opportunity. The new king would need advisors who understood English politics, administrators who could run the machinery of government, and courtiers who could provide the magnificence and hospitality that royal dignity demanded. Thomas Howard positioned himself perfectly. He demonstrated loyalty, competence, and willingness to serve. The rewards came quickly. In 1603, James created him Baron Howard de Walden. In 1605, he was made Earl of Suffolk. In 1614, he reached the pinnacle of his career when James appointed him Lord High Treasurer of England, effectively the chief financial minister of the realm, controlling the crown's revenues and expenditures, one of the most powerful and potentially lucrative offices in the government. By this point, Thomas Howard, first Earl of Suffolk, had accumulated not just titles and offices, but substantial wealth. The Howards had always been rich, but the Lord Treasurer's position offered opportunities for enrichment that went far beyond his official salary, and Suffolk had plans for that wealth. He looked at the old converted monastery at Walden, the building where his wife's ancestors had lived, and decided it was entirely inadequate to his dignity. An earl might live in a converted abbey, but the Lord High Treasurer of England, a man who regularly hosted the king himself, required something far grander. He would build a palace, not just a large house, but a palace that would rival the greatest royal residences, a palace that would proclaim to the world that Thomas Howard, Earl of Suffolk, stood at the very pinnacle of English society, a palace so magnificent that even the king himself would be impressed. It was this ambition, this hubris, this determination to create something unprecedented that would produce Audley End, and that would ultimately destroy its creator. The decision to demolish the old converted abbey and build a new was not made lightly. Demolition was expensive, and the scale of what Suffolk envisioned would require resources on an almost unimaginable level. But by around 1605, the decision was made. The old buildings would come down. In their place would rise the most spectacular prodigy house of the Jacobean age. The term prodigy house requires explanation, for it captures something essential about the building culture of late Elizabethan and early Jacobean England. These were houses built not primarily for domestic comfort, but for display. Vast showpieces designed to impress, to demonstrate wealth and power, to serve as stages for royal entertainment. They were called prodigy houses because they were prodigies, marvels, buildings so large and so elaborate that they provoked astonishment. Burghley House, Longleat, Wallerton Hall, Hatfield House, these were the great prodigy houses of the Elizabethan era, and Suffolk intended Audley End to surpass them all. But who would design this marvel? In the early 17th century, architecture as a profession barely existed in England. There were no architects in the modern sense, no Royal Academy, no system of professional training, no distinction between architect and builder. Great houses were designed through a collaborative process involving the patron, who had the ultimate vision, surveyors, who could draft plans and calculate proportions, and master masons, who actually understood how to construct buildings. Later sources attributed the design of Audley End to Henry Howard, Earl of Northampton, Suffolk's uncle, and a man known for his learning and sophistication. Northampton had travelled extensively in Europe, had studied architecture in Italy, and understood the latest continental fashions in building. He died in 1614, but his influence on the design seems clear. Audley End reflects knowledge of the latest European trends, particularly the French château style that was becoming fashionable. The master mason was Bernard Jansen, also spelled Jansen or Johnson, a craftsman of Flemish or Dutch origin who had worked on other major projects including Hatfield House and Northumberland House. Jansen would oversee the actual construction, translating vision into stone and timber. A plan was also drawn by John Thorpe, one of the most important surveyors of the period, whose collection of architectural drawings provides our best evidence for late Elizabethan and Jacobean building design. Thorpe's plan for Audley End, which survives, shows the extraordinary ambition of the project. 2 great courtyards, each surrounded by residential ranges, state apartments of enormous size, galleries running the full length of the building, service wings, towers, elaborate gardens. This was not merely a house, it was a self-contained world, a stone universe designed to accommodate and impress the royal court. The layout was carefully designed around the requirements of royal hospitality. When King James visited, and Suffolk clearly intended him to visit frequently, he would process through a carefully choreographed sequence of spaces, each grander than the last, each reinforcing his dignity and Suffolk's generosity. The king would have his own suite of apartments. The queen would have hers entirely separate, reflecting the dual courts that characterized Jacobean royal households. Lesser courtiers would be accommodated in chambers graded by status, each person sleeping and dining according to strict hierarchical protocols. The style would be Jacobean, that distinctive English interpretation of continental Renaissance classicism, characterized by tall windows, elaborate gables, towers and turrets, symmetrical facades, and stone construction. But it would also incorporate elements of the French château style, the dramatic skyline, the emphasis on towers, the grand scale. And it would feature the kind of elaborate sculptural decoration, cartouches, strapwork, heraldic devices that proclaimed the owner's status and lineage. Suffolk reportedly told King James that the house would cost $200,000 to build, an almost incomprehensible sum in early 17th century terms. To put this in perspective, the total annual revenue of the English crown at this time was around $500,000. Suffolk was proposing to spend nearly half the crown's annual income on a private house. In modern terms, adjusting for inflation and economic growth, this would be equivalent to perhaps $2 to $3 billion, enough to build several of the world's most expensive skyscrapers, or a dozen luxury hotels, or a significant portion of a royal palace complex. Where would this money come from? Suffolk was wealthy, but not that wealthy. The truth, as would later become clear, was that Suffolk intended to use his position as Lord Treasurer to, shall we say, supplement his building fund. The line between official revenues and personal wealth was always blurry in early modern government, and Suffolk intended to exploit that ambiguity to the fullest. Construction began around 1605 and would continue for nearly a decade. The scale of the operation was extraordinary by any standard. The old abbey buildings were demolished, their stones either reused or carted away. The site was cleared, foundations were dug, and the slow, painstaking work of building in stone commenced. Audley End would be built primarily of stone rather than brick, a choice that immediately signalled wealth and permanence. Stone was expensive. It had to be quarried, shaped, transported and laid by skilled masons. The nearest suitable stone quarries were miles away. Every ton of building material had to be hauled by cart over rough roads or by barge along rivers. The logistics alone were daunting. The workforce required was enormous. At the height of construction, hundreds of men must have been employed on the site: master masons and their apprentices who cut and shaped the stone, carpenters who built the timber roof structures and floors, glaziers who installed the enormous windows, plasterers who created the elaborate decorative ceilings, painters and gilders who added colour and precious metal to the decoration, labourers who dug foundations, hauled materials, mixed mortar, and performed the back-breaking physical work that any major construction project requires. Many of these craftsmen were brought from abroad. English masonry was competent but conservative. For the kind of elaborate decorative work Suffolk envisioned, the sculptural details, the carved ornament, the sophisticated stonework, continental craftsmen were essential. Masons and carvers came from France, the Low Countries and Italy, bringing with them techniques and aesthetic sensibilities that were still novel in England. The materials, too, were international in origin. While much of the stone was English, likely quarried in the Midlands, other materials had to be imported. Glass for the vast windows came from the continent, where glassmaking had achieved a sophistication England could not yet match. Timber for the roof structures included great oak beams from English forests, but also exotic woods for interior panelling. Marble for fireplaces and decoration was imported from Italy. Lead for the roofs, iron for fittings, lime for mortar, all had to be sourced, purchased and transported to the site. Bernard Janssen, the master mason, faced the monumental task of coordinating all of this. He had to ensure that materials arrived when needed, that craftsmen were employed efficiently, that the construction proceeded according to plan, and that the quality of workmanship met the exacting standards Suffolk demanded. It was a logistical and managerial challenge as much as a technical one. The building rose slowly, first the foundations and ground floors of the main ranges, then the upper stories, built up course by course. The great courtyards took shape, their dimensions vast even by the standards of royal palaces. The towers rose at the corners, their height emphasizing the building's skyline and its resemblance to a French château. The facades were articulated with regular rhythms of windows, tall mullioned windows with stone surrounds, flooding the interior with light. The roofline became increasingly complex as gables, parapets, chimneys, and decorative elements were added. Inside, the Great Hall was taking shape on the same site where the abbot's lodging had once stood, and where Sir Thomas Audley had built his Tudor hall. This would be the ceremonial heart of the house, a soaring space where Suffolk could receive guests, host feasts, and display his magnificence. Adjoining it would be the state apartments, a sequence of rooms increasing in formality and exclusivity, culminating in the presence chamber where the lord, or visiting king, would receive visitors while seated in state. The galleries were particularly important. Long rooms, often running the entire length of a building's facade, galleries served multiple purposes in Jacobean houses. They were spaces for exercise, promenading indoors during bad weather, for displaying art collections, though picture galleries as such were still rare, for informal socializing, and for processions. Audley End's galleries were designed to be spectacular, long enough to impress. Well lit by ranks of windows, their ceilings elaborately plastered with the geometric and naturalistic patterns that characterized Jacobean decorative taste. By 1614, the house was sufficiently complete for King James to visit. He came twice that year, in January and in July, and must have been impressed, for this was exactly the kind of setting that appealed to his sense of royal dignity. Here was a house worthy of a king, built by a subject but clearly designed with royal use in mind. Suffolk had achieved his goal. He had created a palace. But the cost had been staggering. Suffolk's boast of $200,000 may not have been an exaggeration. And as would soon become clear, much of that money had come from sources that were, to put it mildly, improper. To understand what Suffolk created, we must take a detailed tour of the house as it existed in the 1610s and 1620s, before the demolitions that would reduce it to its current size. Close your eyes and imagine arriving at Audley End in its full glory, around 1620. You are a visitor of some importance, perhaps a courtier, a foreign diplomat, or a wealthy merchant, and you have been invited to stay. You approach from the main road that runs through the estate. Even from a distance, the house dominates the landscape. Its stone facade stretches impossibly wide. Towers rise at intervals along its length. The roofline is a dramatic skyline of gables, chimneys, and turrets. As you draw closer, the scale becomes overwhelming. The main front extends perhaps 250-300 feet across, the length of a football pitch. This is not a house. It's a small city, a palace complex, a self-contained world of stone. The entrance front is carefully composed. In the centre, a great gateway leads through into the first courtyard. The gateway is elaborately decorated, carved stone surrounds, heraldic achievements displaying the Howard coat of arms, perhaps statuary and niches. On either side of this central gateway, the facade extends symmetrically, with regular rhythms of windows indicating the rooms within. At each end, towers rise higher than the main roofline, their silhouettes echoing the tower houses of medieval castles, but executed with Renaissance regularity. You pass through the gateway into the first courtyard, the outer court, which contemporaries would have called the base court. This is a vast, open space, surrounded on all four sides by building ranges. The courtyard is perhaps 100 feet square, large enough to maneuver carriages and for dozens of people to mill about without crowding. The ground is probably paved with stone or cobbles. The ranges surrounding you contain service rooms, storage, accommodations for lesser servants, and all the infrastructure needed to run a great household. Directly opposite the entrance, on the far side of this outer court, is another gateway leading to the inner court. This gateway is even more elaborate than the first, signalling the transition from service areas to state apartments. You pass through. The inner court is smaller, more refined, more obviously ceremonial. Here the architecture becomes richer. The stonework is more finely carved. The windows are larger and more regularly spaced. This courtyard is the heart of the house, and the ranges surrounding it contain the principal apartments. On the far side of the inner court, a door leads into the Great Hall. You enter. The Great Hall is vast, perhaps 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and soaring to a height of 40 feet or more. The walls rise through 2 stories, with tall windows on both sides flooding the space with light. The ceiling is the first thing that captures your attention. It's not the open timber roof of a medieval hall, but a plaster ceiling, elaborately decorated with geometric patterns, ribs and pendants. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Swirling strapwork, floral motifs, heraldic devices, all executed in white plaster and picked out with gilding. At one end of the hall, raised on a dais, is the high table where the lord sits during formal meals. Behind it, elaborately carved wooden panelling rises to the ceiling. At the other end, a screens passage separates the hall from the service areas, the traditional medieval arrangement, but here executed with Jacobean sophistication. Above the screens passage, a gallery allows musicians to play during feasts, their music filling the great space. The walls are hung with tapestries. Not just any tapestries, but elaborate woven narratives commissioned specifically for this house. Suffolk had ordered sets depicting classical scenes, the campaigns of Hannibal and Scipio from Francis Spearing of Delft, one of the most renowned tapestry workshops in Europe. These enormous hangings, woven with coloured wool and silk thread, perhaps touched with gold and silver, depict battle scenes, triumphs, councils of war. They serve multiple purposes. They demonstrate Suffolk's wealth, tapestries of this quality cost fortunes, his classical learning, choosing subjects from Roman history, and his taste, patronising the best workshops. The fireplace is monumental, large enough to roast whole oxen, its surround carved with heraldic devices and classical motifs. During winter months, fires blazing here would struggle to heat the vast space, and visitors would cluster near its warmth. From the Great Hall, a door leads to the state apartments. You process through a series of rooms, each grander than the last. First, the Great Chamber, where the household dines communally. Then the Presence Chamber, where the Lord, or visiting king, sits in state to receive visitors. Here there is a canopy over the chair of state, marking it as a quasi-royal throne. The decoration is increasingly elaborate. The ceilings are masterpieces of plasterwork. The panelling is carved wood, perhaps ebony or walnut, certainly expensive. The windows look out over the gardens. Beyond the presence chamber is the privy chamber, where only the most privileged visitors are admitted. And beyond that, the bedchamber, the most private space, though by early 17th century standards, even this is semi-public, with courtiers attending the lords rising and retiring according to elaborate ritual. But this is only the king's apartment. The Queen has her own identical suite, completely separate, perhaps in the opposite wing. This reflects Jacobean court practice, where the king and queen maintained separate households with separate servants, separate budgets, separate ceremonial routines. The galleries are extraordinary. Running the full length of the building's main facades, they are perhaps 150 feet long but only 20 feet wide, long, narrow spaces lit by continuous rows of windows on one side. The ceilings are elaborately plastered. The floors are wooden, perhaps covered with rushes or mats. These are spaces for promenading, for conversation, for display. On rainy days, courtiers can exercise here. During festivals, they might be used for dancing or theatrical performances. Throughout the house, the decorative detail is overwhelming. Carved wooden panelling with intricate geometric patterns, plaster ceilings with ribs, pendants, cartouches, and naturalistic ornament, stone fireplaces with classical columns, pediments, and heraldic achievements, painted decoration picking out architectural details in gold and bright colours, stained glass windows depicting religious or allegorical scenes. The service areas are equally vast but hidden from view. Kitchens with enormous fireplaces and brick ovens, sculleries for washing, pantries and butteries for storing food and drink, cellars for wine and beer, storerooms for grain, meat and other provisions, workshops for household craftsmen, stables for dozens of horses, accommodations for scores of servants. This is Audley End at its height, a palace disguised as a private house, or perhaps more accurately, a private house that has become a palace. It was designed to accommodate and impress the royal court. It succeeded. But the cost of that success would prove ruinous. Thomas Howard, Earl of Suffolk, had achieved his dream. By 1614 he possessed the most spectacular house in England and held one of the most powerful offices in the realm. But his position was built on a foundation of corruption that was obvious to everyone who cared to look. The office of Lord High Treasurer was notoriously lucrative, but Suffolk had taken exploitation to new levels. As Treasurer, he controlled the Crown's revenues and expenditures. Money flowed through his office: taxes, customs duties, feudal dues, fines, sale of offices, and dozens of other revenue streams that fed the Tudor-Stuart state. In theory, this money belonged to the Crown. In practice, there were endless opportunities for officials to help themselves. Suffolk and his wife Catherine operated what can only be described as a system of institutionalized embezzlement. Offices were sold to the highest bidder, with the proceeds pocketing rather than going to the Crown. Customs duties were collected but not fully accounted for. Contracts were awarded to cronies who paid kickbacks. Accounts were falsified. The line between official revenue and personal income, always blurry, was essentially erased. Catherine Howard, Countess of Suffolk, was particularly notorious. Contemporary sources describe her as grasping, ambitious, and utterly shameless in her pursuit of wealth. She operated openly, accepting bribes from those seeking offices or favours, selling her influence with the king, and accumulating a personal fortune that rivaled her husband's. She was, in many ways, the power behind the throne, or at least behind the Lord Treasurer's office. This could not continue indefinitely. By 1618, rumours of corruption had become too loud to ignore. King James, who was no fool despite his reputation for lavish spending and favouritism, ordered an investigation. The results were damning. In 1619, the Earl and Countess of Suffolk were formally charged with embezzlement, taking bribes, and misappropriating Crown revenues. The trial was a sensation. Evidence was presented of systematic corruption on a massive scale. The precise sums involved are difficult to determine. Accounting standards were rudimentary, and much of the evidence has been lost. But the amounts were clearly enormous. Some sources suggest that Suffolk and his wife had stolen the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds, perhaps even approaching the $200,000 Suffolk had supposedly spent on Audley End. Both were found guilty. The sentence was harsh: imprisonment in the Tower of London, the fortress prison where so many nobles had been held before execution. For the Suffolks, this must have seemed like the end. The Tower had been the last stop for two Howard family members already. Catherine Howard and the 4th Duke of Norfolk had both been executed. Was Thomas Howard destined to follow them to the scaffold? But this was not Tudor England, and James I was not Henry VIII. The king was angry at the corruption, but not bloodthirsty. Suffolk and his wife were imprisoned, but not executed. Instead, they were offered a way out. Pay an enormous fine, and you will be released. The fine was crushing, $30,000, an immense sum even for a man of Suffolk's wealth. To pay it, the Earl had to liquidate assets, sell properties, borrow money. But he paid, and he and his wife were released from the Tower. They were disgraced but alive and technically still wealthy. They retired to Audley End, the palace that had consumed so much of their wealth and that had been built, at least in part, with stolen money. Thomas Howard, 1st Earl of Suffolk, lived here in semi-disgrace until his death in 1626. He was 65 years old. The man who had dreamed of building a palace had succeeded, but the price had been his reputation, his office, and very nearly his life. Catherine survived him by several years, dying in 1633. She remained unrepentant to the end, a woman who had pursued wealth and power with single-minded determination, and who saw nothing wrong in using her position to enrich herself. When Thomas Howard died in 1626, his son Theophilus Howard inherited both the title of second Earl of Suffolk and the enormous debts that came with it. The younger Suffolk was a different man than his father, less ambitious, less flamboyant, less willing to engage in the kind of spectacular corruption that had characterized his father's career. But he inherited a financial catastrophe. The debts were staggering. 132,000, more than twice the amount of the fine his parents had paid to escape the Tower. Where had these debts come from? Partly from the fine itself, which had been paid through borrowing, partly from the cost of maintaining Audley End, which was ruinously expensive, partly from legal expenses, lost revenues from forfeited offices, and the general financial chaos that surrounded the family's disgrace. Theophilus did what many aristocrats in his position did. He married for money. His wife brought a substantial dowry, which temporarily eased the financial pressure. But Audley End remained a burden. The house required constant maintenance. The lead roofs needed repair. The stone facades needed cleaning and repointing. The elaborate plaster ceilings cracked and had to be restored. The gardens needed tending. And all of this required money. Money that the second Earl of Suffolk simply did not have in sufficient quantities. James Howard, third Earl of Suffolk, who inherited in 1640, faced even greater challenges. By this point, England was sliding towards civil war. The long-simmering conflict between King Charles I and Parliament was about to explode into open warfare. The third Earl and his wife Susanna were deeply religious, devout Protestants who sided with Parliament in the coming conflict. They lived at Audley End during the 1640s, the decade of civil war, seeing their world torn apart. The Civil War, 1640 to 1651, devastated the English aristocracy. Estates were confiscated, houses were fortified and then besieged. Families were divided by political and religious loyalties. Audley End survived physically. It was never besieged or damaged in battle, but financially the family continued to struggle. The third Earl died in 1689, having presided over decades of slow decline. By the mid-17th century, a new reality was becoming clear. Audley End was too large. It had been built to accommodate the royal court. But the Civil War had changed everything. Charles I had been executed in 1649. England had been a republic for over a decade. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, the new king, Charles II, had different ideas about royal residences and about how he wanted to live. Charles II, who returned from exile to reclaim his throne in 1660, represented a new kind of monarch. He had lived in France during his exile and had been deeply influenced by the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who was transforming Versailles into the most spectacular palace Europe had ever seen. Charles wanted something similar, a palace that reflected his taste, his dignity, and the restored glory of the monarchy. But Charles also loved horse racing, and the centre of English horse racing was Newmarket, a small market town in Suffolk where the aristocracy gathered to race horses, place bets, and socialise. Charles visited Newmarket frequently, sometimes spending weeks there during the racing season, but Newmarket itself had no suitable royal residence. Charles needed somewhere nearby to stay, somewhere worthy of a king. Enter Audley End. The house was only about 15 miles from Newmarket, an easy ride or carriage journey. It was vast, certainly large enough to accommodate the royal court, and the Suffolk family, still struggling with debt, might be willing to sell. On October 8, 1667, Samuel Pepys visited Audley End and recorded his impressions. By this time, negotiations for a royal purchase were likely already underway. Pepys's diary entry is frustratingly brief. It is a very fine house. But the fact that he visited at all suggests that the house was being seriously considered. In 1668, the deal was done. Charles II purchased Audley End for $50,000, a fraction of what it had cost to build, but still a substantial sum, enough to significantly ease the Suffolk family's financial burden. The house became royal property, and Charles began using it as a base for his visits to Newmarket. For about 3 decades, Audley End was a royal palace. Charles II stayed here regularly during the racing season. His court followed. The state apartments, designed for just such royal occupancy, were finally being used as intended. Courtiers vied for the honour of accompanying the king. Elaborate entertainments were staged. The house fulfilled the purpose for which it had been built. But there was a problem. Even for a king, Audley End was too large. The cost of maintenance was enormous. Keeping the vast building heated during winter was nearly impossible. The staff required to run it was huge, and Charles, chronically short of money despite being king, began to question whether this massive palace was worth the expense. Moreover, architectural tastes were changing. By the late 17th century, the Jacobean style was beginning to look old-fashioned. The English aristocracy was increasingly interested in classical architecture, the pure, symmetrical style based on ancient Roman models that was being developed by architects like Inigo Jones and would reach its peak with Christopher Wren. Audley End, with its towers and gables and complex skyline, seemed medieval, old-fashioned, a relic of an earlier age. Charles II died in 1685 and was succeeded by his brother James II. James II's brief reign, 1685–1688, ended with his overthrow in the Glorious Revolution. The new monarchs, William III and Mary II, had no particular interest in Audley End. The house sat largely unused, maintained at royal expense but serving no real purpose. In 1701, the Crown returned Audley End to the Suffolk family. The experiment in royal ownership had lasted just 33 years. The house was once again a private residence, but now it faced an uncertain future. By the early 18th century, the reality could no longer be denied. Audley End was too large for any private family to maintain. Even the Crown had found it burdensome. The Suffolk family certainly could not afford to maintain a palace of this scale. The solution was drastic: reduce the size of the house by demolishing portions of it. This was not an uncommon practice in the 18th century. Many great Elizabethan and Jacobean houses were reduced in size, as families found them too expensive to maintain or as architectural tastes changed. But the scale of demolition at Audley End was particularly dramatic. In 1708, Sir John Vanbrugh was commissioned to work on the site. Vanbrugh was one of the leading architects of his generation, famous for Baroque masterpieces like Castle Howard and Blenheim Palace. But his work at Audley End involved not creation, but destruction. Under his direction, the entire outer court, the vast base court with its surrounding ranges, was demolished. The main gateway, the service wings, all of it came down. Thousands of tons of stone were reduced to rubble, some reused elsewhere on the estate, some simply carted away. The demolition continued in 1753, when the east wing was removed. This eliminated one of the two great courts around which the original house had been organised. What remained was essentially one court with its surrounding ranges, about one-third of the original building. This reduced Audley End to approximately its current size. What survives is still a very large house by any standard. Dozens of rooms, elaborate state apartments, a great hall that is one of the finest surviving Jacobean interiors in England. But it is only a shadow of the palace that Suffolk built. The demolitions were not carried out with any particular care for architectural integrity. Walls were simply cut away. Ranges were removed. The result was a building that, while still impressive, had lost its architectural coherence. The original symmetry was destroyed. The great processional route, entrance court to inner court to great hall to state apartments, was truncated. What had been designed as an integrated palace complex became a somewhat awkward single courtyard house. But the building survived, and the Suffolk family, later the Braybrook family, when the estate passed through the female line, continued to live here and gradually adapted the reduced house to 18th century taste. The Georgian transformation, capability Brown and Robert Adam. In the second half of the 18th century, Audley End underwent another transformation, this time aesthetic rather than structural. Sir John Griffin, 4th Baron Howard de Walden and 1st Baron Braybrook, inherited the property in 1762. Griffin was a successful military officer and a man of refined taste who wanted to modernise his ancestral seat. He commissioned two of the most celebrated figures of Georgian architecture and landscape design, Lancelot Capability Brown for the grounds and Robert Adam for the interiors. Capability Brown was the most famous landscape designer of his age, the man who created the English landscape garden, that naturalistic style of parkland that replaced the formal geometric gardens of earlier periods with rolling lawns, irregular clumps of trees, serpentine lakes and carefully orchestrated views. Brown earned his nickname Capability from his habit of telling clients that their estates had great capability for improvement. At Audley End, Brown swept away the formal Jacobean gardens, the parterres, the geometric layouts, the elaborate topiary that had surrounded the house. In their place, he created rolling parkland that extended right up to the house's walls. The River Granta, which flows through the estate, was incorporated into the design, crossed by elegant bridges. Trees were planted in carefully calculated positions to frame views and create the illusion of natural countryside, even though every element was carefully planned. Brown also added garden buildings, classical temples and follies that served as focal points for views and as destinations for walks. The Temple of Concord, designed by John de Val and added in 1790, was a romantic folly in the neoclassical style, a circular domed structure that would not have looked out of place in ancient Rome. These elements transformed Audley End's setting from a Jacobean showpiece to a Georgian Arcadia. Inside the house, Robert Adam was working his own transformation. Adam was the leading interior designer of his age, famous for a refined neoclassical style that emphasized delicate ornament, classical motifs, and elegant proportions. His work can be seen in dozens of great houses across Britain, including Kedleston Hall, Sion House, and Osterley Park. At Audley End, Adam redesigned the ground floor reception rooms in the neoclassical style. He created a suite of rooms characterized by delicate plasterwork in low relief, classical columns and pilasters, refined color schemes, and carefully integrated furniture and decoration. The contrast with the Jacobean interiors above must have been striking, moving from Adam's cool neoclassical elegance to the exuberant complex decoration of the Jacobean staterooms was like travelling between centuries. Adam's work at Audley End represents the clash of two aesthetic systems, the rich, complex, somewhat overwhelming style of the early 17th century versus the refined, rational, carefully controlled style of the late 18th century. Both are present in the house today, and the juxtaposition is fascinating, showing how architectural taste evolved over 150 years. Sir John Griffin died in 1797, having transformed Audley End from a somewhat awkward, truncated palace into a Georgian country house of the first rank. The building had been adapted once again, its multiple layers of history now including not just the Jacobean palace, but also Georgian refinement. The 19th century brought yet another shift in taste. The Georgian enthusiasm for classical architecture gave way to a renewed interest in the Gothic and Jacobean periods. The Victorian age was fascinated by medieval and early modern England, by chivalry, by romantic nationalism, and by architectural styles that seemed quintessentially English rather than borrowed from classical antiquity. Richard Griffin, 3rd Baron Braybrooke, who inherited Audley End in 1825, embraced this new aesthetic. He was a scholar and antiquarian, deeply interested in history and convinced that the Jacobean portions of Audley End were its greatest glory. While his grandfather had modernized the house with Adam's neoclassicism, Richard Griffin wanted to restore something of its original Jacobean character. He filled the house with a massive collection of paintings, many of them portraits of historical figures. He furnished the rooms with 17th century furniture or Victorian reproductions in the Jacobean style. He restored some of the Jacobean plasterwork that had been damaged or covered over. He wanted visitors to feel that they were experiencing an authentic Jacobean palace, not a Georgian house with a Jacobean core. Lord Braybrooke also added to the house's collections in other ways. He was an editor of Samuel Pepys's diary, one of the scholars who first made that invaluable historical source accessible to modern readers. His library at Audley End became famous among antiquarians and historians. He corresponded with other collectors, visited historic houses, and gradually assembled a collection of paintings, furniture, books, and objects that turned Audley End into a kind of museum of English history. This Victorian enthusiasm for the Jacobean had a paradoxical effect. On one hand, it preserved and restored elements of the house that might otherwise have been lost. On the other hand, it created a somewhat idealized vision of the Jacobean past, filtering 17th century reality through 19th century romantic nationalism. The Victorian period also saw the creation or recreation of period rooms, spaces decorated to evoke specific historical moments. This was a common practice in the 19th century, when country house owners wanted their homes to be not just comfortable residences, but also educational experiences, family museums that told the story of English history through architecture and objects. The 20th century would bring challenges that earlier generations could never have imagined. 2 world wars, social revolution, the collapse of the country house system that had sustained places like Audley End for centuries, all of this threatened the survival of England's architectural heritage. During the Second World War, Audley End was requisitioned by the government. The family was evicted, and the house was taken over by the military. Initially, the government was uncertain what to do with it. When the Dunkirk evacuation brought the British Expeditionary Force home from France in May-June 1940, leaving behind most of its equipment, and with German invasion seeming imminent, the government briefly considered using Audley End as a military facility. But the house lacked the necessary infrastructure, modern plumbing, electrical systems, communications, and the offer was declined. In March 1941, the house was requisitioned again, this time by the Special Operations Executive, SOE, the secret organisation responsible for espionage, sabotage, and supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe. The SOE needed training facilities, safe houses, and holding camps for agents preparing for missions behind enemy lines. Audley End became Special Training School 43, STS-43, one of dozens of country houses used by the SOE. Its primary function was as a base for the Polish section of the SOE. Poland had been invaded and partitioned by Germany and the Soviet Union in September 1939, and the Polish government in exile in London was desperate to support resistance inside occupied Poland. The SOE trained Polish agents, the Cichociemni, or Silent Unseen, who would be parachuted back into Poland to fight the occupiers. These were men of extraordinary courage. They knew the odds. Capture by the Gestapo meant torture and death. The survival rate for SOE agents was low, yet they volunteered, trained at places like Audley End, and then disappeared into the night sky over Europe, parachuting into darkness to fight for their country's freedom. At Audley End, they learned parachuting, weapons handling, explosives, hand-to-hand combat, radio operation, codes, and all the other skills needed for clandestine warfare. The elegant Jacobean rooms that had once hosted courtiers and kings now echoed with the sounds of military training. The parkland designed by Capability Brown became a training ground. 108. Polish agents trained at Audley End died in the service. Many others survived to fight throughout the war. Their sacrifice is commemorated by a war memorial on the main drive, the Polish SOE War Memorial, unveiled on June 20, 1983, and Grade 2 listed in 2018 as a monument of national historical importance. After the war, the 9th Lord Braybrooke resumed possession. But the world had changed. The country house system, the social and economic structure that had sustained great estates for centuries, was collapsing. Death duties, estate taxes, made it nearly impossible to pass estates intact from generation to generation. Maintenance costs were soaring. Servants were impossible to find and impossible to afford. Many great houses were demolished in the decades after World War II. Others were sold, converted to institutions, or simply abandoned. In 1948, the Braybrooke family made a difficult decision: sell Audley End to the nation. The buyer was the Ministry of Works, the government department responsible for historic buildings, which would later become English heritage. This was not a forced sale, but a negotiated preservation agreement. The family could no longer afford to maintain the house, but they wanted to ensure its survival. The government wanted to preserve an important piece of England's architectural heritage. The deal preserved Audley End for future generations, while ensuring that the Braybrooke heirs retained certain rights, including portions of the contents of the house, elements of the estate, and remarkably, the right to repurchase the property if the government ever decides to sell. This last provision, an incorporeal hereditament, a legal right without physical form, is almost unique in English property law and reflects the family's continuing connection to the house even after relinquishing ownership. Since 1948, Audley End has been in the care of English Heritage, originally the Ministry of Works, then the Department of the Environment, and from 1984 English Heritage as a separate entity. This has ensured professional conservation, public access, and scholarly research. English Heritage's stewardship has involved careful restoration work. The Jacobean plasterwork has been conserved, with damaged sections repaired using traditional materials and techniques. The Robert Adam rooms have been restored to their original colour schemes, based on analysis of paint layers and historical research. The Great Hall has been maintained as one of the finest surviving Jacobean interiors in England. The collections have been catalogued and studied. The paintings include works by major artists as well as historical portraits. The furniture spans several centuries, from genuine Jacobean pieces to Victorian reproductions. The house's library contains rare books and manuscripts, including material related to the Braybrook family's scholarly interests. Public access has been carefully managed. Unlike some historic houses that have been extensively altered to accommodate modern visitors, Audley End retains much of its original atmosphere. Visitors can walk through the Great Hall, the state apartments, and the Adam rooms, experiencing the multiple layers of architectural history. The house is used for educational programs, school visits, and scholarly research. The grounds have also been carefully maintained. Capability Brown's parkland remains largely intact, with its rolling lawns, mature trees, and carefully framed views. The River Granta still flows through the estate, crossed by elegant bridges. The neoclassical follies still serve as focal points for walks. In 1999, English Heritage undertook an ambitious project to restore the walled kitchen garden, which had fallen into neglect. Using an 1877 garden plan and William Cresswell's journal from 1874, Garden Organic, formerly the Henry Doubleday Research Association, recreated a Victorian kitchen garden complete with heritage varieties of fruits, vegetables and herbs. Completed in 2000 and opened by Prince Charles, the garden now grows 120 varieties of apple, 60 of pear, and 40 of tomato, all using organic methods that would have been familiar to Victorian gardeners. The kitchen garden has become a major attraction in its own right, demonstrating how great estates were self-sufficient in food production. Visitors can see espaliered fruit trees trained against brick walls, glass houses for tender plants, vegetable beds laid out in traditional patterns, and herb gardens. Some of the produce has been supplied to the Dorchester Hotel in London, creating a direct link between historic horticulture and modern fine dining. But preservation presents ongoing challenges. In 2014, an English Heritage report identified a serious threat: flooding from the River Cam, another name for the River Granta. Climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of floods, and the report detailed extensive threat to the estate affecting a wide zone alongside the River Cam, potentially damaging access roads, masonry, and the land surface. This is a reminder that historic preservation is not static, but requires constant vigilance and adaptation to changing environmental conditions. Today's visitor to Audley End experiences a house that is, paradoxically, both fragmentary and complete. Fragmentary because 2/3 of the original palace has vanished, leaving only hints of the colossal scale Suffolk intended. Complete because what survives is so substantial, so carefully preserved, that it stands as one of England's finest Jacobean houses. Approaching from the road, you still see an impressive facade, though you must imagine it extending another 200 feet in each direction to grasp the original scale. The stone cladding, unusual for English houses of this period, most used brick, gives Audley End a continental, chateau-like appearance. The towers, the gables, the regular rhythm of windows all speak to the Jacobean love of symmetry and display. The inner courtyard, the one that survives from the two original courts, gives a sense of the grand scale. Standing in this space, surrounded by 3-story ranges, you can imagine the processions, the arrivals of important visitors, the bustle of a great household. The stonework, weathered by 4 centuries, has a golden grey patina that glows in sunlight. The Great Hall remains magnificent. Walking into this space, you immediately understand why contemporaries were impressed. The soaring ceiling with its elaborate plasterwork, the tall windows flooding the room with light, the carved wooden screen — this is Jacobean architecture at its most confident and accomplished. The tapestries, though not the originals commissioned by Suffolk, are of the period and give a sense of how the walls would have been covered with woven narratives. The state apartments preserve the processional sequence of rooms increasing in privacy and formality. You can trace the route a visitor would have followed in the 17th century, from the great chamber through the presence chamber to the privy chamber, and finally to the bedchamber. Each room has its own character, its own treasures. The plasterwork varies from room to room, demonstrating different aspects of Jacobean decorative art. The fireplaces, with their elaborate overmantels, are carved with heraldic and classical motifs. The Robert Adam rooms on the ground floor offer a complete contrast. Here the decoration is refined, delicate, controlled. Classical motifs in low relief, elegant proportions, carefully chosen colour schemes. It's like moving from a rich Baroque opera to a chamber music recital. Different aesthetic languages, both accomplished in their own terms. The picture collection is substantial, with portraits spanning several centuries. Here is a visual history of the families who owned Audley End, the Howards, the Braybrookes, their relatives and connections. Historical portraits of monarchs, courtiers and notable figures create a gallery of English history. Outside, the Capability Brown parkland is one of his most successful designs. The house sits in rolling meadows that stretch to distant tree belts. The River Granta flows through the grounds, its banks landscaped to look natural but actually carefully designed. The bridges are elegant stone structures that serve as focal points for views. Walking through this landscape, you experience the Georgian ideal of nature and architecture in harmony. The Temple of Concord, reached by a walk through the parkland, is a delightful neoclassical folly. Its circular form and domed roof evoke ancient temples, but it was built purely for aesthetic pleasure and as a destination for walks. The restored kitchen garden is a revelation for anyone interested in historical horticulture. To see heritage fruit varieties trained on walls, to walk through vegetable beds laid out according to Victorian principles, to understand the enormous labour that went into feeding a great household, this is living history, demonstrating skills and knowledge that almost disappeared but have been revived. The story of Audley End is ultimately a story about ambition, hubris and survival. Thomas Howard, Earl of Suffolk, dreamed of building a palace that would rival the grandest royal residences. He succeeded, creating one of the largest and most spectacular houses in England. But his ambition consumed him. The cost of building Audley End drove him to corruption on a massive scale, leading to disgrace, imprisonment and financial ruin. The palace he created was too large for any private family to maintain, forcing future generations to reduce it to a manageable size, yet Audley End survived. It survived demolition when 2/3 of the original building was torn down. It survived changing architectural fashions from Jacobean exuberance through Georgian neoclassicism to Victorian revivalism. It survived requisition during World War II and transformation into a military training facility. It survived the collapse of the country house system in the 20th century. Today, it stands as a testament not just to one man's ambition, but to the multiple generations who adapted, maintained, and preserved it. Audley End is a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written, erased, and written again, with traces of every stage still visible. It is Jacobean at its core, with the great hall and state apartments that Suffolk created. It is Georgian in its parkland and ground floor interiors, shaped by Capability Brown and Robert Adam. It is Victorian in its collections and its antiquarian spirit, reflecting the 19th century's fascination with England's past. And it is modern in its preservation and presentation, carefully maintained by English heritage for public benefit. Walking through Audley End today, you are walking through English history. You are experiencing the ambition of the early Stuart court, the corruption that stained it, the changing aesthetic values of successive centuries, and the dedication of those who fought to preserve this architectural treasure. You are seeing what remains of a dream that was too large for any one man, yet somehow survived to inspire future generations. The palace that Suffolk built no longer exists in its full glory, but what remains is more than enough to remind us of an age when nobility meant not just title and privilege, but also the responsibility to create beauty that would outlast any individual life. Audley End stands as a survivor, a fragment of a larger vision, a monument to both the hubris and the nobility of the Jacobean age. It reminds us that great architecture is never just about buildings. It's about the people who created them, lived in them, destroyed and restored them, and ultimately chose to preserve them for future generations. It's about the intersection of personal ambition and historical forces, of individual lives and national culture. Audley End is not just a house, it's a window into the past, a place where history becomes tangible, where you can stand in rooms where monarchs walked and decisions were made that shaped a nation. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even the grandest dreams must eventually confront reality, that hubris has its price, but that beauty, once created, has a power of its own to survive even the death of the dreamer. Thomas Howard, Earl of Suffolk, died in disgrace nearly 4 centuries ago, but his palace lives on, reduced in size but not in grandeur, a testimony to the enduring power of architecture to transcend the flaws and failures of its creators and speak to future generations about the aspirations and achievements of the past.